All right, so good morning, good afternoon, and a very warm welcome to today's webinar, What Does Environmental Due Diligence Look Like? A comparative look at the EU Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive and the German Supply Chain Act. My name is Valentina Bolognesi. I'm Advocacy and Engagement Advisor at Amfori, and it is my great pleasure to welcome again today so many of you to this webinar. So thank you for the interest and for the also appreciation that you show for the work that we do. Again, a reminder that this is a joint undertaking also with the Partnership for Sustainable Textiles and also with the support of the German Helpdesk on Business and Human Rights. So an opportunity for me to thank the two organizations again on behalf of Amfori for this very fruitful collaboration that has been going on now for more than 1.5 years. If we could quickly move to the next slide, going through the housekeeping rules that you are by now all familiar with. You are muted. Nevertheless, we do encourage you to use the Q&A function to post your questions. We will have a dedicated Q&A session at the end of the webinar. And the idea is to take questions live, but also to answer those that we cannot address orally in writing. As a reminder, the webinar is being recorded and the recording and the slides will be shared after the webinar. We are also going to share a satisfaction survey, and this is very important for us because we really want to understand whether the webinar met your expectations. So if you have any feedback, constructive feedback to share with us, please do take the time to answer the survey. Now, taking a look at the agenda, if we could move to the next slide, please. What to expect out of today's webinar. After very high-level introductory remarks by my side, we're going to hand over to Michaela Streibelt from the Helpdesk on Business and Human Rights, and she will take a deep look at the thematic aspect of the EU CSDDD and German Supply Chain Act in as far as the environmental due diligence is concerned. And then we're going to be moving into the practical side of things, sharing examples of industry practice and industry approaches to environmental due diligence that can actually support companies with aspects of their due diligence. And last but not least, Q&A at the end of the session and closing remarks. Now, if we could quickly move to also the next slide, I would like to, just as a reminder, put this webinar into context. It comes as part of a series of webinars on due diligence laws in practice. Up until March this year, the webinars very much focused on the German Supply Chain Act. But as of May, we started to switch gear and to address aspects pertaining to the EU Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, since the text is now final, and we're actually awaiting in a matter of days the publication of the text in the official journal of the EU. But the idea actually that I would want to also place with you is that some of the topics that we unpacked in the past can still remain very relevant also in the context of emerging obligations, such as those stemming from the CSDDD. As an example, the topic of a grievance mechanism or responsible purchasing practices, just to mention a few, are still very relevant also for the context of the EU CSDDD expectations. Also, just to state perhaps the obvious, the intention is to continue organizing those webinar series in the future. Therefore, do keep an eye out for the work that we do. Moving on to the next slide, please. I would like to, before Michaela zooms in on the thematic aspect of environmental due diligence, I would like to zoom out for a second and offer a small reflection when looking at the evolving regulatory landscape pertaining to responsible business conduct due diligence post UNGP. So we already showed this slide during the May webinar. So we see different laws emerging, some focusing on specific risks, others addressing specific sectors, others mandating companies to mostly be transparent and report on their efforts, up until the latest generation, we can call it this way, of laws, to which I would argue the German Supply Chain Act and the EU Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive belong. They actually are much more encompassing, and they also are cross-thematic in the sense that they bring environment and human rights due diligence together. So this means practically, if we could move to the next slide, if we take the example of the CSDDD, that the methodology, the risk-based due diligence methodology, which is not a new methodology, but actually is taken almost one-to-one from relevant international standards on RBC, this very same methodology needs to be applied by companies in scope to understand how they connect to adverse impacts, both at the level of human rights and the environment. And the same goes for the identification, the prevention, the mitigation, etc., etc. So it's one methodology, the same risk-based due diligence approach that applies both to human rights and environmental impacts. What the CSDDD does on top, and I think that Michaela will speak to this, it also adds in a provision under Article 22 for companies to take actions on climate transition plans. If we could move to the next slide, also in the interest of time, we talked about international standards, and I would just want to also reflect on the fact that there has been an important update to the OECD MNE Guidelines on responsible business conduct, a document that provides recommendations to businesses on how to conduct risk-based due diligence to avoid connecting to a wide range of sustainability impacts. The most notable sort of update that concerned the 2023 version of the guidelines has to do with the environmental obligations or the environmental expectations when it comes to managing environmental impacts. So in case companies want to understand a little bit expectations also going beyond legal provisions, I think that's an important document to be aware of. And this document also acknowledges that environmental impacts are often closely interlinked with other matters that are covered by the guidelines. So if we could quickly move to the next one, I just want to also reflect on the fact that it's not just about bringing human rights and environmental impacts together, converging under one legal instrument as a trend that we see, but we also see the more and more an interlinkage between human rights and environmental impacts. This, for instance, is also exemplified in the understanding that now environmental degradation can threaten the enjoyment of human rights, if we think of the UN General Assembly resolution adopted in 2022, but also more broadly about the just transition and all the considerations as to how companies can apply a human rights lens to their climate action. That's all from my side in the interest of time. Now I would like to hand over to Michaela, if we could move to the next slide, to take a closer look at environmental due diligence in both the CSDDD and the German Supply Chain Act. Thank you, Misha.
Yeah, thanks very much. Really great to be addressing this topic. I think this is incredibly important and something that I experience companies need to take a closer look at and aren't yet doing this. So we have a lot on our agenda in relation to environmental due diligence, because this really is a barrel without bottom, relevant for pretty much all industries. Going to the next slide. And then already the next, you can look at the copyright when you're given the slides after the webinar. And the next two slides I'm going to skip. This is about the services of the help desk, something I've explained in the other webinars already. Also next slide, please. And the next slide, you can look at this when you receive the slides. So we can directly start with the subject matter today, protected environmental obligations. On this slide, you see all the international conventions the CSDDD has taken recourse to, and in particular, the CSDDD describes specific provisions and obligations from these conventions. So it doesn't mean that all of these conventions with all the provisions and obligations are relevant for companies, but just the ones that are explicitly mentioned in part 2 of the annex to the CSDDD. And you probably see that three of them, you can see that three of them are highlighted in orangey red. The Stockholm Convention, the Minamata Convention, and the Basel Convention. And these three are environmental conventions that are already relevant in the context of the German Due Diligence and Supply Chains Act. And as you can see, the CSDDD really expands the material scope in relation to environmental protection. The CSDDD, also similar to the German Supply Chain Act, has one protected legal position that is kind of at the borderlines between environment and human rights, which is the destruction of natural resources through pollution, as it's abbreviated on this slide. So it's a little bit more complex, but we'll look at this more in depth. And additionally, also the CSDDD obliges companies to design and implement a plan to combat climate change, which is something we'll also have a look at. In relation to all of these conventions, I'll quickly run through them with you. We will not take a deeper dive into all of them because this would exceed the time that we have available today, but maybe we'll take a closer look at these conventions in the future. So in addition to the three that we'll take a deep dive on, the CSDDD takes recourse to conventions protecting biodiversity, endangered species, wetlands, marine life, the atmosphere, the ozone layer, the UN Convention on Biological Diversity, together with its protocols, Cartagena Protocol and Nagoya Protocol, protects biological diversity. There's the Washington Convention on the Protection of Endangered Species, the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, in particular in relation to this convention. It's about certain behavior, pollution in relation to dumping in the sea. So the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea has all kinds of prohibitions that don't relate to the environment. Then there's the International Convention for the Prevention of Pollution from Ships. So this is about preventing pollution from ships. The Rotterdam Convention on the Prior Informed Consent Procedure is a convention in relation to export and import of certain chemicals and provides for the so-called Prior Informed Consent Procedure, the PIC procedure. It's also often called PIC Convention. And this the convention works in the way that it has a list of listed chemicals. And in relation to these particular substances, member states of the convention are only allowed to import it into a state if this state consented prior to the export. Then we have the UNESCO Convention on the Protection of World Cultural and Natural Heritage. In the context of the CSDDD, the CSDDD takes recourse to the obligation to avoid or minimize adverse impacts on the properties delineated as natural heritage in the context of this convention. Then there's the Vienna Convention for the Protection of the Ozone Layer and its Montreal Protocol. This relates to particular substances that are known to deplete the ozone layer and prohibition in relation to their manufacturing, and then rules on storage, disposal, and so on. And then the Ramsar Convention on Wetlands of International Importance. This is a convention that works in a way that states have to define wetlands that are protected and then undertake certain measures to protect them. And in the context of the CSDDD, companies, so the protected legal position is that the obligation to avoid or minimize adverse impacts on these defined wetlands. Yes, so and when we look at on the next slide, how are these protected legal positions in relation to the environment, and then obviously this borderline position that is environmental impact with human rights consequences, the destruction of natural resources position, how do companies have to address them in their risk management system? And I thought I'll bring you a slide where we have a little graphic of the risk management system on the CSDDD. With strategy and implementation, risk analysis, the climate plan is integrated here, even though it's not part of the risk management system, preventive and corrective measures, complaints and notification procedures, monitoring and communication. And in the context of the risk management system of the CSDDD, companies will have to identify potential and actual negative impacts in relation to these protected legal positions that I've just explained. And then they have to address them with preventive and corrective measures. The complaints and notification procedure is something that also obviously resolves around these protected environmental positions, as well as the protected human rights positions. Monitoring and communicating is something that companies will have to do in relation to the whole risk management system. So this will also cover the identified potential and actual impacts in relation to these positions and the activities that companies do and in relation to preventing and addressing them. And then obviously stakeholder engagement is relevant in relation to all of these due diligence obligations. This is why it's in the center. And then strategy and implementation is obviously needs to encompass what companies do, the activities companies do to address potential and actual impacts in relation to these positions. The climate plan, as you will see, doesn't actually belong into this risk management system. It's a little bit outside of it because it's a little bit different. Companies need to design and implement a climate plan, but they don't have to identify risks in relation to climate. For example, they don't have to implement preventive and corrective measures. The climate plan is a little bit different to that. And on the next slide, I'm going to show a slide that those of you who've seen the last webinar in relation to the CSDDD have seen already as well. Where could these potential and actual negative impacts on these protected environmental positions arise? The CSDDD takes recourse to the so-called chain of activities. And the chain of activities is not the complete value chain, but it encompasses both the upstream and the parts of the downstream value chain. Both direct and indirect business partners are part of the chain of activities. The CSDDD doesn't actually directly differentiate between direct and indirect business partners, as does the German Supply Chain Act, but also the German Supply Chain Act is not a tier 1 law. This is a very common misunderstanding in relation to the German Supply Chain Act, and the CSDDD also addresses the whole upstream value chain, and differences between direct and indirect partners can only follow because of, for example, different ability to influence an indirect business partner or different level of contribution to a negative impact. But generally, companies will have to identify and address negative impacts in relation to these environmental positions as well as the human rights position in their whole upstream value chain. They will also have to do that in relation to their own operations and all control subsidiaries. Control subsidiaries are always part of the chain of activities. And then they will have to address these potential and actual impacts in relation to downstream activities, but only if in relation to distribution, transport, storage, if it is for on behalf of the obliged companies. So on the next slide, I would like to dive into our first protected legal position in relation to the human rights and the environment, which is actually the position that is kind of between or both an environmental and human rights protected legal position. And I think it is quite clear that it is very difficult to differentiate between human rights and the environment. Actually, without a healthy environment, it is impossible to enjoy pretty much all human rights. But both the German Supply Chain Act and the CSDDD define a specific position that only relates to negative impacts into the environment if they lead to particular negative consequence in relation to human rights. And it's in both laws, both the Supply Chain Act and the CSDDD, defined as causing harmful soil change, water pollution, air pollution, harmful noise emissions, and excessive water consumption. And in addition, in the CSDDD, it explicitly also refers to degradation of land and other impact on natural resources, such as deforestation. So this is an explicit recourse that the Supply Chain Act does not take. But in relation to the negative consequences arising from this emission, both laws are the same. So significant impairment of the natural basis for the preservation of and production of food, denying a person the access to clean drinking water, obstructing the access to or destructing sanitary facilities, or harming the health of a person. So I think it's quite clear that in most cases in relation to this type of pollution, soil change, water pollution, air pollution, noise emissions, excessive water consumptions, these typically lead to these negative human rights consequences. So in almost all cases, these kinds of emissions will harm the health of persons, will impair natural bases for the preservation and production of food, deny access to clean water, and might even destroy or obstruct the access to sanitary facilities. And the next slide, I want to take a look at what are risk sectors, risk products, and country-specific risk factors in relation to this type of adverse impact, the adverse environmental impact with human rights implications. And risk sectors are all types of heavy industry, also the textile industry. And maybe this is something known in this audience, but the textile industry is actually the second most polluting industry directly after the oil industry. Then the chemical pharmaceutical industry, as I mentioned already, the oil industry, but also gas and coal industries. Agriculture is very heavy on the environment because of, for example, agrochemical products. Then the mining industry, and risk products would be all agricultural products, which also would include most food and beverages. And in this context, agricultural products would also include fishery, then mineral raw materials and rare earths, which are products that are sourced from mining, and obviously all products that contain these raw materials and rare earths, so phones, laptops, pretty much most electronics, batteries, electronic cars, and so on. All chemicals, all pharmaceuticals, and all agrochemical products as their own. And country-specific risk factors are, on the one hand, the quality and the enforcement of standards in relation to environmental protection, occupational health and safety, chemical safety, and waste. And it's really important here to distinct between the quality and the enforcement of standards. Most countries in the world have, all countries in the world actually have laws in relation to the protection of the environment. Most constitutions actually in the world recognize a right to a healthy environment, but the problems arise on the one hand on the quality of these types of standards. In some countries, they might not be sufficient to protect people and the environment from harm. And then not only the quality of these standards, but also the level of enforcement. So even in some countries, the standards might be very good, but enforcement is not sufficient to effectively protect. And then another risk factor is the overexploitation of natural resources. Coming to the next slide, taking a closer look at the environmental positions that we're taking a deep dive on, which are the ones that are already protected under the German Due Diligence in Supply Chains Act, the Minamata Convention on Mercury, the Stockholm Convention on Persistent Organic Pollutants, and the Basel Convention. We've made a little overview here with the goals, measures, and where they're implemented in EU law. Even though this is just nice to know information, it's not necessary. Some of these other conventions CSDDD takes recourse to are not implemented in EU law directly, but some of them are just implemented in the law of the member states. To give you a quick overview, the goals of the Minamata Convention are the protection of human health and the environment from the release of mercury and mercury compounds into air, water, and soil because of the toxicity of mercury. And the measures of the convention are regulated, so basically prohibiting extraction and use of mercury, certain mercury compounds, and mercury-added products, and the obligation to treat mercury waste in an environmentally sound manner. The Stockholm Convention's goals, very similarly, all of these conventions' goals are actually the protection of human health and the environment, but in this case, particularly from the release of persistent organic pollutants. We'll take a closer look at what those are. And then the measures is prohibiting the production and use of certain POPs. The convention works in the way that they list specific persistent organic pollutants, and the obligations of the convention only apply in relation to listed substances. And then there's an obligation of environmentally sound handling, collecting, storing, and disposing POP wastes. The Basel Convention governs the export of hazardous and specific other wastes, and it aims at ensuring environmentally sound disposal of these wastes, ideally close to the point of origin, and reducing the amount of hazardous waste produced. And the mechanism of the convention is that it prohibits import of export of waste governed by the convention, and provides for rules in relation to who's allowed to export what type of wastes to whom. We'll take a look at that as well. It's a little bit complex. Yes, so this much as an overview over these three conventions we're taking a deep dive into, and I'm going to start, I think, with the Minamata Convention on mercury on the next slide, please. So Minamata Convention applies, governs mercury in order to protect human health and the environment. And I'm trying to both, govern what's protected under the German Supply Chain Act and the CSDDD. So sometimes you'll find insertions like on this slide where there's a little difference to the CSDDD. The CSDDD, has several prohibitions in relation to the Minamata Convention, same as the German Supply Chain Act, which is the prohibition of production, import, and export of products containing mercury according to annexes of the convention. So similarly to other conventions in international environmental law, the convention also works with a list of particular substances. Then the prohibition of the use of mercury and mercury-added products, mercury compounds, after a particular phase-out date for the specific product, which is also specified in the convention. And then there's a prohibition of treating mercury waste contrary to the provisions of the conventions. Mercury is a natural element. It is, I don't know if you've ever seen it. I, as a child, once bit on a thermometer with mercury. It's actually liquid in elementary form, which is quite interesting for a metal, volatile at room temperatures, and neurotoxic. And yeah, in relation to the implementation in the EU, laws also here work with prohibitions, restrictions, and phase-outs. And it is obviously possible that the Minamata Convention rule, for example, are violated, but at the same time, this also leads to, for example, harming the health of a person. And this would also mean that the general prohibition to harming natural resources and leading to negative consequence for human rights would also be violated, but they could also be violated separately. So not only is this general norm violated when one of the specific conventions is violated, is a little bit broader. Let's take a look on the next slide at risk sectors, risk products, and country-specific risk factors. You will see that some of the industries are very relevant in relation to all environmental regulations and conventions. Risk sectors here, again, mining, especially informal artisanal mining, gold mining. When in the context of mining, not only substances are removed from the ground that are wanted, but oftentimes substances will be bound with other elements that will be removed from the ground and that are toxic. Mining also has a lot to do with removing water from the ground in order to keep dry mines, and with this water, oftentimes substances that used to be bound in the ground together with the elements that are being mined are removed, leading to collecting toxic sludge in dams. Often relates to risks of these dams breaking, a very common problem, or leaking into natural waterways. And again, the oil, gas, and coal industry, production of cosmetics, interestingly, the electronics industry, and the chlor-alkali industry. And risk products in relation to the Minamata Convention are batteries, fluorescent lamps, electrical switches and relays, all plant protection products, especially stocks, cosmetics, again, especially lightening and anti-aging products, and dental amalgam, so a very common filler for dental works. And then country-specific risk sectors. What's really relevant in this context are the priority countries of artisanal mining. These would be, for example, the People's Republic of China, Indonesia, Sudan, Ghana, Peru, the Democratic Republic of Congo, South Africa, Argentina, Brazil, and Chile. Then another risk factor would be the status of ratification of the Minamata Convention. But again, you need to be careful, because just the fact that a country has ratified the Minamata Convention doesn't necessarily mean that it is it has laws, environmental standards of sufficient quality, or is enforcing them well enough, which is the next risk factor. Again, as on relation to the Minamata Convention, quality and enforcement of standards in relation to environmental protection, occupational safety, and chemical safety. And obviously, these activities in relation to the Minamata Convention, they are not only relevant in relation to environmental protection, they are also relevant in relation to, for example, occupational safety, chemical safety. So in many cases, many of these protected legal positions might be intersecting in one specific incident where Minamata Convention rules are violated, where there's the general norm on environmental impacts with human rights consequences is violated, but also at the same time, health of a person is violated, occupational safety rules are violated. So yeah. On the next slide, coming to the Stockholm Convention on Persistent Organic Pollutants, and both the Supply Chain Act and the CSDDD prohibit the production and use of certain persistent organic pollutants. Yeah, and as I said already, the convention also works in the way that it lists particular persistent organic pollutants. This list is continuously expanded. The convention started with the so-called dirty dozen, so just 12 chemicals, and now I think it's over 30 chemicals that are listed. And the other prohibition is the not environmentally sound handling, collecting, storing, and disposing of waste in accordance with the relevant provisions of the conventions. What are persistent organic pollutants? So obviously the convention only takes recourse to those that are listed, but there are other substances that qualify as persistent organic pollutants, and potentially these might be included into the annexes of the conventions. The criteria for POPs is that they're persistent, that they bioaccumulate, that they biomagnify, that they have long-range transport and adverse effects. And there's exceptions in relation to specific persistent organic pollutants. For example, PCB, but also DDT, which is not on this list, DECA, BDE, PFOA. So certain substances that, even though they are listed, the annexes also will provide for exceptions, because there's particular really important use and not yet substances that would make good replacements for these substances. One example is DDT, for example, a really old POPs, plant protection product, which has been, I think, prohibited in most of the EU since the 70s, but it's still allowed to be used to prevent malaria. It's used to destroy certain types of mosquitoes in waterways, and the benefits outweigh the risks in this context. So let's have a look again at risk factors, sectors, products, and country-specific risk factors. Again, it's the usual suspects: chemical industry, but here also the construction sector, pulp production, paper industry, agriculture, textile. Textile industry also relates to agricultural industry when thinking, for example, about the production of cotton, which interestingly is not only very water intensive, but also very pesticide intensive, with lots of use of plant protection products. And then industries using thermal processing technologies, so waste incineration and metallurgy. And risk products would be electrical appliances, motor vehicles, flame retardants, plastics, coated specialty papers, for example, for fax machines or for getting receipts at supermarkets, plant protection products again, and then organic waste containing chlorine. And country-specific risk factors, it's very similar to the other conventions. So on the one hand, the status of ratification of the convention, but here again, be careful, also look at quality and enforcement of standards in relation to environmental protection, occupational safety, and chemical safety. Let's have a look at our last convention that we'll take a deep dive into, which is the Basel Convention relating to the export of hazardous waste and certain other wastes, both governed by the Supply Chain Act and the CSDDD. And the rules of the Basel Convention are a little bit more complex. So the Basel Convention, the rules that the CSDDD and the Supply Chain Act are taken recourse to, apply to the prohibition of export of hazardous waste and certain other wastes, but it's not a general prohibition, but it depends on who's exporting waste to whom. So there's a prohibition to export waste to a party that has prohibited the import of these types of wastes. Then there's a prohibition to export waste to a state of import that doesn't consent in writing to the specific import, in the case where the state of import has not prohibited the import of such waste. So either they prohibit it or they have not prohibited it, but have not consented in writing. Then it's generally prohibited to export these wastes to non-parties of the Basel Convention. This is because the Basel Convention assumes that non-parties to the convention will not make sure that the wastes are disposed in an environmentally sound manner. And in general, there's also even if, for example, the state of import is a member state of the Basel Convention, even then it might be prohibited if the state of import does not manage these wastes in an environmentally sound manner in the state itself or elsewhere. So this might also prohibit contexts in which a chain of exports is suspected. Then there's another prohibition. There's a list of states in an Annex 7, and these states are not allowed to export into states which are not listed in the same annex. And then, generally it's not allowed to import waste from a non-party to the convention. Let's have a look again at risk factors, sectors, products. So risk sectors again are the chemical pharmaceutical industry, textile industry, and waste management industries. Risk products are waste that are listed in the convention. So in the annexes 1 and 2, really similarly, again, the convention works with a system of listing certain products, waste, substances, and then country-specific risk factors, again, ratification status, but also quality and enforcement of standards. So on the next slide, we'll leave the CSDDD's risk management system of identifying negative impacts and addressing them with preventive and remedial measures and go to the plan combating climate change. I've explained that this is kind of removed from this risk management system that the CSDDD obliges companies to implement. And the plan to combat climate change is just the best effort obligation to ensure that the business model and strategy are compatible with the transition to sustainable economy and with the limiting of global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius and the objectives to achieve climate neutrality until 2050. Companies will have to update the plan every 12 months, but enforcement by the supervisory authorities is a little bit different than in relation to the due diligence obligations of the CSDDD. The supervisory authority only assesses the adoption and content of the plan. Many companies that are in the scope of the CSDDD, almost all companies in scope of the CSDDD will also be in scope of the CSRD, at least sooner or later, depending on the transposition laws and the application of the obligations to specific groups of companies. But companies that also already report a transition plan according to the CSRD are deemed to have complied with the obligation to adopt the plan, but they will still have to fulfill the plan and update it every 12 months. And quickly in relation to the content of the plan, the companies will have to define time-bound targets for until 2030, and then in 5-year steps up until 2050, and they will have to base these time-bound targets on conclusive scientific evidence, as well as where appropriate, they will have to define absolute emission reduction targets for scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. So this is actually a really high level of complexity in relation to what companies have to do to understand the climate emissions that they cause in these 3 scopes. Then they will have to describe decarbonization levers and key actions. They will have to explain and quantify investments and funding that they make in relation to meeting the goals of the plan. And they will have to describe the role of administrative management and supervisory bodies in relation to fulfilling the plan. So with this, I conclude my presentation in relation to the environmental due diligence in relation to the CSDDD and the Supply Chain Act. And I hand over to you, Isabel.
Thank you very much. And I hope that you can all hear me well. Also, good morning or good afternoon from my side, and happy to be here on part of the Partnership for Sustainable Textiles. Before we're gonna do a bit of a, let's say, deep dive into environmental due diligence in practice, I would just like to remind you that you can ask your questions at any time, also during the next presentations, and then we have time in the end to answer those. So please use the Q&A function in Zoom to post your questions, and I highlight those that we will answer live at the end of this session, and then we're also answering some of them in writing while we're speaking. So that's just a bit of a reminder. Use the opportunity to post your questions and engage. And with that, I would like to hand over to the first deep dive on environmental due diligence in practice, and to Bruno from amfori, who's going to talk about the amfori BP. Bruno, the floor is yours.
Yes, hello. Can you just confirm that you can hear me?
We can.
Okay, good. Hi, everyone. I'm really happy to be here. Thanks for joining us. I'm going to introduce amfori BPI, which is one of the different products that we have at amfori. Let's move on to the next slide, please. And there you go. But first of all, I'm not sure if everyone here knows amfori. You will see that this presentation is quite linked to what just happened right now, which was really great. I really enjoyed that presentation on the different obligations and legislative pieces and packages, because it's super related to what we do in practice, right? I mean, all of this seems to be somewhere up there in the air, but then we have to put it in practice so that different companies can actually work on it in different ways. It's super complex, and we really try to provide some solutions. So if you don't know what amfori is, amfori has been around for a while, actually, since the 1970s. We work, we're a trade association, but we work for trade with purpose. That's our motto. We deliver social, environmental, and economic benefits. We support companies in driving social, environmental, and economic benefits for everyone. It's a global association. We're all over the world, and we work on all the pillars: environmental, social, and governance. And I always want to say that, of course, we have a very big support from advocacy. We have a capacity building team as well that is very big. That sometimes gets lost when we only look at these initials. We have about 2,400 member companies, and then we have supply chains from these member companies mapped in our systems that cover several tens of thousands of factories. I think I can't remember the number right now. I think 70-something thousand factories all over the world that we're supporting. Can we go to the next one, please? Very quick snapshot of a map. Maps are always lovely to watch. So there you go. That's where we are. You can see some of them in blue. In dark blue, you can see the countries where we have members. So we have members right now in over 50 countries. And then we have sourcing factory sites in over 110 countries. And we have 16 local network reps. So we have offices in 16 different locations in the globe. So we're truly global. And we go to the next one, please. All right. But we do a lot of things. We have a lot of pillars, but today I'm going to focus on amfori BPI. We have our social tool, our social product, which is amfori BSCI. It's very well known. It's likely that many of you here will know it because it's been around for a long time and it's highly recognized. amfori BPI is our environmental performance in global supply chains product. And then we have other things like amfori Speak for Change, amfori Advocacy, QMI, and many others. But I'm going to focus on amfori BPI today on the environmental pillar. Now, what is amfori BPI? So amfori BPI has 8 performance areas. These 8 performance areas are highly related to what we saw in the presentation before. And it's no surprise because all the different legislative pieces like CSRD, Triple D, and everything else, we all share, let's say, a basis, a common ancestor, right? Like Luca in biology. Well, this is our common ancestor. We're talking about, for example, UNDP, OECD, and GRI standards, and so on and so forth that serve to feed all these different pieces. We also have used this. And of course, our environmental performance area has super related to this and include questions related also to what you just saw before. It's multi-sectoral. We're sector agnostic. So we have different companies from many different sectors. We have tons of retailers, electronics, toys, textile, even food, and many others. Environmental risk is at the core. And when we talk about risk, we're talking about the risk that the supply chains pose to environment and people, but for BPI, we're focusing on environment, yes? So we're talking about environmental impacts that the companies can have on environment, yes? There's a set of tools to support in mitigation, and we'll talk about that later. And then, of course, we have dashboards, which people really like always. We have amfori Insights, a business intelligence tool, where you can actually use this information you gather when you map supply chains and do all these activities, and then you can use it to decide what to do next or to report if you need to. Lots of trainings. This is very important. It's huge at amfori. So yeah, we have tons of trainings that can be super helpful for members and for companies, and qualifies service providers. We work with several auditing companies that do verification on site, and we also have our local offices. Next slide, please. All right, now what amfori BPI is not. Well, we're not a certification scheme. We're not a product label, and we're not intended to be used as a product label. We do look into legislation, like I just said, like new coming legislation, and we try to support our members by assessing some of the key features that they need to assess, but we cannot always we cannot always assure that you are complying with legislation because we're global. We take into consideration local regulations, regional regulations, and so on and so forth. So we try to support, but we cannot be considered a legal compliance tool. It is not a one-off process. At amfori, we believe in continuous improvement and continuous improvement of performance in due diligence when we look at supply chains. It's not only for business partners. We don't work only with factories. We also work with companies. But the whole point of our platform is that it's a collaborative platform where members work with the factories, and also they do share information between different companies, which is really cool. And yeah, and it's not isolated. Even though we're going to talk about environment, keep in mind that amfori BSCI and the governance products are all part of the same system, which means that any member company would be able to assess all the impacts on the different pillars under one same platform. Next one, please. Next, yeah, there you go. Now, quick look at our environmental performance areas. This comes as no surprise. They're absolutely related to what was being discussed before. Environmental management systems, that's always very important. Then we have energy and climate. There's some questions also, generate questions with metrics. We do measure intensity of emissions, energy, wastewater, water, waste, and so on. Then we have water and effluents, emissions square, where we also ask certain questions related, of course, to, I don't know, ocean depleting substances from Montreal Protocol. Then we have the chemicals as well. We have also questions regarding to chemicals that are also part of the Basel Convention and Minamata and so on. So we have these 8 environmental performance areas, and we also have on the side an environmental due diligence questionnaire based on the German Supply Chain Act that is a little bit more specific on German Supply Chain Act and asks certain things, including, for example, the use of mercury and so on. But as you can see, it's quite comprehensive. These 8 environmental performance areas, some of them include 2 different things like water and effluents because they're quite related. There's a reason for that. It makes our questionnaires more targeted for our factories, and it makes it easier for them to respond. Next one, please. Why is it? Why do we recommend to use amfori BPI? I don't know if any of you here knows amfori BPI or is considering using it. First of all, it's easy and quick. It's very easy to invite business partners, and if you're using the social pillar, you can already map the supply chain really easily. The journey is quite flexible. The dashboards, like I mentioned, are super useful because you can download all the information to be able to work with it if you're a company. All these are optional, but they have a really good value because you can verify data. They're quite flexible. You can focus on a few or on all environmental performance areas. Risk assessments are tailored specifically for each sector. So, like I said, we're multi-sector. We're not only textile or only, I don't know, working on furniture or whatever, or electronics. We can work for anyone. So the risk assessments are tailored for each of these sectors. This reduces fatigue and also reduces fatigue because we collaborate with, there's several layers of collaboration. For example, members in the platform can already see the information that has been uploaded to business partners that they share with other members. This reduces fatigue for them and for business partners because they don't need to be constantly repeating the risk assessments or the audits. But we also collaborate with other organizations that we share data with and also with the social and governance pillar. And then we have several metrics that support, for example, in reporting to, we're talking about ESRS or we're talking about climate commitments, SBTIs, and so on. Our tools can help in supporting companies and factories also in the reporting. Next one, please. If I go over time, please do let me know, because my watch ran out of battery. So please do let me know if I'm running out of time. Okay, next one, please. I'm going to show you the BPI journey, and then I will frame it under the due diligence steps, try to give it a little bit of clarity. Okay, I hope I can achieve that. This is a snapshot of our journey. As you can see, it's really two journeys because we have the member journey. The member is the company, let's say a big retailer or an SME in Europe or in the United States or whatever. And then we have the journey of the business partner, which is on the right. So this is our journey, which is basically doing a materiality assessment, mapping the supply chain, and then assessing the risks, and then acting upon those risks to reduce them, which is doing our improvement activities. Then you can monitor and report on this, on the results, and then the cycle starts again. Please, let's go to the next one. I'm gonna go a little bit quickly through this because I think I have 5 or 6 minutes. Okay, if we look at the different steps of OECD, for the first step, embedding responsible conduct, we have a code of conduct. Companies sign a code of conduct when they participate in our BPI and they commit to certain values and principles. I also have to say that we have several capacity building and materials and trainings that companies can also take in order to move into this direction. Let's go to the next one, please. If we look at step 2, there you go. This looks very messy, but I'll explain why. It's just because there's 2 cycles, but it's basically the same thing. When we look at assessing risks, the thing is that risk is core to the system, so it goes throughout many of the different steps of our journey. Materiality assessment, of course, you know, that's key, and we provide support for that as well. Supply chain mapping, because you have to decide which parts of the supply chain are at risk, and then we have several tools that can help you, like the ESG risk compass and so on, but I'm not going to go into that. But our platform provides members with assistance to identify which parts of the supply chain they should be focusing on, but ultimately it's up to them at their materiality assessment. And then, of course, the business partner, the factory, provides in our system, they create their site details, and our system will tell them, based on your industrial processes, these are the highest risk. No, not the highest risk, sorry. These are the environmental performance areas that could potentially be at highest risk. So we will ask you certain questions. And then our system will ask those questions and the risk will be assessed. Yes? This is basically step 2 in our platform. Sorry that I'm going really quick, but I know we're tight on time. Let's take you 1 second. I'll leave this slide for you to check, but basically the risk assessment and our API is based on likelihood and severity of the impact. We use a big array of different industrial processes in order to also decide which are the key environmental performance areas that are relevant to those industrial processes. And then the business partner, which is the factory, the site, will have to fill in a questionnaire, and then this questionnaire will come back with a result of which are the highest, of the different risk levels per environmental performance area. Those 8 areas that I showed you before, the system will tell you what are the highest risks so that the companies can then act. Next one, please. Related to this, we also have, like I mentioned before, something on the side, which is the environmental due diligence questionnaire, which can also let our members know, especially those that are in Germany, because it's based on the German Supply Chain Act. This is just an 8-question questionnaire that can help them at least see more or less how these sites are performing regarding, I mean, what is the risk regarding the German Supply Chain Act. It's just 8 questions, but it also helps, and it's available in the Sustainable platform. So this is also risk assessment in a way. Let's move to the next one, please. Now, if we go to step 3, ceasing and preventing and mitigating risk, that's where we have our improvement activity. We have audits, on-site verification audits, and these audits will be always complemented by a mandatory corrective action plan. Our auditors are highly trained specifically for amfori BPI and for environmental issues, and they must indicate which things need to be improved and how they need to be improved. And this goes to the factory and the members, all linked members, so that they all can act and support these business partners in improving. Let's say they have issues managing their chemicals, then they will have to put in place a chemical management system, or they will have to do something with the way they store the chemicals, or they will have to map them or whatever. This will be stored, it will be communicated, and then we have a continuous improvement feature in our platform where members and business partners can communicate and follow up on the improvements before they do a follow-up audit. And this is very important because continuous improvement is key to environmental due diligence and to reducing risks. Let's go to the next one. I think I have 2 minutes or 3. This is just an example of what an environmental monitoring result looks like. We provide a grading from A to, sorry, A, B, C, D, E, and also color grading just because it looks really nice. And then you will be able to see all the results with all the referring questions, the corrective actions, etc. This is just a snapshot, but just so that you have an idea more or less how we work. It's also aligned with the social pillar. So anyone doing due diligence on social and environmental will be able to easily understand what are the levels of risk and also monitor them with a very similar approach. Let's move to the next one, please. Corrective action plan, like I just mentioned, it's mandatory. It's more or less how it looks. Don't worry about it. It's just so that you know that there is always a corrective action plan. It's always important to fix issues. Next one, please. Step 4, tracking implementation and results. We do have several dashboards where you can see the results and how they're going. We also have the continuous improvement feature that is related to the audits. So, and you can also do a follow-up audit if you want, but you can always see what's going on, track the results, and then decide what to do on the next cycle. Yes, it's very important that it's not a one-off process, that we repeat this cycle depending on the results, and then we can continue. Okay, I think 2 minutes is 58, almost done. Next slide. This is just an example of a dashboard. Next slide. We have energy and climate dashboards. We know climate is key, so we do measure emissions, scope 3 emissions based on energy consumption on site, and we provide our members with a dashboard so they can download data and then report with it. Next one, please. I'm almost done. Communication. We do have, like I said, again, the dashboard that you can use to download data and use it as you wish, if you're a member. Next one, please. And then this is just a very big snapshot of all of our different features. Like I said, everything, even though I'm talking about environment, all the different features are part of one system, and this system is based on the 6 steps. I know this slide may not be the clearest one in the world, but just so that you see that BPI and BSCI, social and environmental, go hand in hand, and the governance products give a sort of complementarity to these 2 products. Let's go. Next one, please. I don't know if I'm already done. Yeah, I'm already done. 1 minute. So I know I run a little bit and I talk really quickly, but I was getting some messages from Valentina telling me that I had to be over, so I tried to comply.
Thank you, Bruno. Also, there are a lot of questions now also on the BP tool in our Q&A, so maybe you can answer some of those already in writing. That would be great and highly appreciated.
Thanks. Thanks a lot.
Great, thank you. And so we'll move on to my colleague Valeska from the German partnership, and also show from that perspective how companies can really in practice also work on those risks and on their environmental due diligence. Valeska, I'll just hand over to you, also in the interest of time. And you can take over.
Thank you, Isabel. I will. Yes, good morning as well from my side to everybody participating here in the webinar. And I will in the next couple of slides introduce you to what we in the Partnership for Sustainable Textiles do to put environmental due diligence into practice. And I'm here together with my colleague Lotta Marmein from JACO. JACO is participating in one of our projects, and she will later on give a little bit of her insights on why they are motivated in participating in, yes, one of our projects. But before I start talking to you about the projects, let me just quickly introduce to you the Partnership for Sustainable Textiles. Who are we? So we are a multi-stakeholder initiative with at the moment 120 members. They come from brands, from civil society organizations, from government, but as well trade unions. And yeah, we have our 10th year jubilee this year, so initiated in 2014 and supported and funded by the Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development. So we've got quite a lot of scopes, but one of our goal really is to support the brands here in Germany and their suppliers in learning and yeah, complying with the new regulations that are coming up on national level, but as well on European level regarding due diligence. And for this, we developed a project approach to work together in so-called partnership initiatives and use these partnership initiatives as a learning field to implement due diligence and as well environmental due diligence. So let me quickly introduce to you 3 projects that we have focusing on environmental aspect. We have got 2 projects that are focusing on circular economy. The first one, the partnership initiative on implementing circularity in the textile industry. Here we have the aim to implement a reversed textile supply chain. So to build expertise on all the upcoming requirements of the new EU regulations, for example, regarding eco-design, due diligence, but as well reporting. And we want to enable the brands and their specific manufacturers in the production countries to successfully realize closed-loop products and circular production processes. And this focuses as well, so talking about circularity always focuses as well on aspects like reducing waste, reducing the use of chemicals, and reducing emissions, so CO2 emissions, and all aspects that we have seen are relevant regarding environmental due diligence. There is the part that as well means implementing a recycling infrastructure that is back here in Germany then. And milestones in this project are really to do webinars and build capacity on circular design strategies and on closed loop processes. So for example, making sustainable material choices, making how to construct sustainably products. So that the brands in this context, they design items, so up to a capsule collection, according to circular design criteria that are developed at the moment, so based on sustainability, on durability, and as well on recyclability. A big part of the project is as well the integration of a digital product passport, so as well part of legislation coming up now, so collecting or selecting informations that is going on this product passport regarding the products, regarding the materials, regarding the chemicals. So yeah, going into transparency and data traceability. And on this basis as well to develop an infrastructure here in Germany for the taking back a sort of intelligent sorting using all these data and recycling. So as you can see here in the project, we really try to cover the whole process of a production cycle. Whereas in the next project, please next slide, on circular down and feathers, we are looking more on the increase of the duration of usage of primary materials. So in this case, really focusing on one material or 2 materials, which are feathers and down. So the idea is to reduce the need of a new primary raw material through recycling material that is here in the country already used, and using this recycled materials in new products. So we want to reduce the emissions, for example, caused by transportation of new downs and feathers. Most part of this material comes from China. Yeah, in using more of the already used products, we try to reduce as well the emissions caused by transportation. The further aspect here is the increase of animal welfare. So one of the milestones touches this through capacity building in the poultry farms in China. We want to establish a collection structure here in Germany for the used bedding and the reprocessing and reusing the down and feathers that are being recycled in new products. And for this, we are preparing a consumer awareness campaign, because still recycled downs and feathers, there is the perceptions that they are unhygienic or not a good quality, but this really is not the case. So we saw that it is important to raise the awareness that we have a really good product here as well if we use recycled downs and feathers in new products. So both these projects focus environmental aspects all through the lens of circular economy. And then we have a third project in this scope on this area, which is the project on supplier decarbonization, so focusing very much on climate aspects. Here, together with 10 brands, we aim in reducing CO2 emissions within the textile supply chain. And we are supporting the brands and their specific suppliers to meet with the new regulations regarding the reduction of CO2 emissions. We are working together with 50 suppliers. These are the direct suppliers of the brands participating. And the idea is not only reducing the emissions, but as well helping the supplier gaining or strengthening their competitiveness, because they start early in the process on what the new regulations will be covering or are covering at the moment. So we want to give them a little bit of a competitive advantage as well. And of course, in medium term or long term as well, reducing CO2 emissions and the greenhouse gas footprint always leads to reducing costs in the production process as well. And milestones here in the project are to help the manufacturers in the production country to understand their greenhouse gas footprint, so to build knowledge on climate-related issues, and to help them collect data regarding their energy efficiency or energy consumption, and to support them on the basis of this data to analyze it and to analyze the energy balance. And with this energy balance as well, to go further and set targets. So these can be small targets for the near future, but as well medium and long-term targets, and help them identify and implement adjustment measures to reduce their energy consumption and their greenhouse gas emissions in the facilities in the production countries. So in this specific project, we are working together with JACO, and Lotta Marmine will explain you a little bit about their motivation, why they are participating in this project. So Lotta, I hand over the word to you.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. I want to start with a quick overview of what JACO is, and then jump directly to the brand's perspective, what was the challenge we had, and then our motivation to join this initiative. First, to those who don't know JACO, we are a German-based company specializing in teamwear, especially in sportswear, but also corporate teamwear. And we equip over 100,000 teams worldwide. But let's start with our challenges. As a textile company, we take responsibility for the supply chain and for the conditions under which we produce. In recent years, like many in our industry, we have focused on social issues such as working hours or wages. However, climate change means that we all need to give more priority to environmental issues. And there were 2 points we recognized. First, the greenhouse gases are produced at all stages along our supply chain. Of course, at our site in Germany, but most of all as indirect emissions in scope 3. And the second one was that we recognized that there's still limited knowledge. As team athletes, we are aware that we cannot tackle sustainability alone. For us, sustainability is teamwork. But I guess we all know that the whole textile industry needs to reduce the emissions. And I guess we all agree that this is a shared responsibility of all the actors that we work with. So what we knew is that we need cooperation with our industry partners, and we need to see which challenges are common to all of us and how we can address them with scalable solutions for emission reduction. Still, the big challenge is that nobody of us really knows how to do that in an efficient way. So it was really perfect for us that this Partnership for Sustainable Textiles offered the initiative. This gives us the opportunity to work on the topic of greenhouse gas reduction together with other brands that have the same challenges as we do. The main advantage we see is that all of the training courses are designed directly for our suppliers. We as brands can also build up our knowledge, exchange ideas with different brands, and learn from each other. We can discuss challenges together and find solutions, but also report on what we have learned. So we have decided to work with two of our most important partners in Bangladesh and Pakistan to support them as long-term partners in their sustainable orientation. For them, digital and hybrid workshops are planned to build knowledge on climate-related issues and to learn to collect data regarding energy efficiency. So we will get the data from the production sites to understand where the energy is consumed, as well as where it's lost on the production sites and on the production processes. As a result, we can use this data to identify and implement adjustment measures that could be taken long-term, but also short-term, to reduce the energy consumption and the greenhouse gas emissions in our suppliers' facilities. So I hope you could get more insights of our perspective, and I will give back the word to Isabel to start with the Q&A.
Thank you very much. We have a lot of questions, so we'll just jump right into them. And Micha, I think I'll start with you. So there are some questions related to the chain of activities and direct indirect suppliers. The first one reads, does the CSDDD require companies to have transparency over the whole chain of direct and indirect suppliers until the raw material level? And then maybe we can combine it with the second one regarding downstream business activities. Is this only referring to direct business activities? Maybe you can answer both of them together.
Yeah, happy to do so. So generally, the CSDDD, it's a little bit unclear what degree of transparency is required by the CSDDD, and it really depends, I think, personally, on the impact and what measures might be possible, taking account appropriateness criteria, which in relation to measures also include influence, contribution, and position of the impact in the value chain. And the risk analysis in relation to the CSDDD requires companies to first do a mapping of own operations, chain of activities to identify areas in which negative impacts are likely and severe. And then in the next steps, companies based on this mapping have to do an in-depth assessment where they prioritize, and in this way they have to prioritize information from business partners where they expect the impact to occur, and will not have problems if they can't obtain the necessary information. The question is, do they have to know who exactly is it is my tier 2 the I don't know, so-and-so SE, or is it which company is it exactly? How can I get in touch with them? This might not always be necessary. This really depends on the measures that companies can do. If you want to look at this more in-depth, look at recital 40 to the CSDDD. Suppliers should not be able to refuse releasing the identity of their direct and indirect suppliers if it's necessary for due diligence, but it might not always be necessary. But companies will have to get an understanding of what are the steps of value creation for the things that they buy, for the services that they use, and need to get an understanding of what impacts might be resulting from them, both in relation to environment and human rights on a more general level, and then depending on what type of measures are possible more. And in relation to downstream, the chain of activities is a little bit limited. So it's distribution, storage, and transport, but only if it's for or on behalf of the company. And this can also theoretically be an indirect business, downstream business partner that's doing something for and on behalf of the company. Let's say if the company authorized someone else to do something for them and gave them the authority to sub-authorize someone else, then I would say it's still on behalf of for the obliged company.
Thank you. Moving on, you mentioned that several of the environmental conventions are already implemented in EU regulations. Is it enough for a company to ensure those EU regulations are complied with by the company itself and their suppliers, or does the company have to conduct due diligence that goes beyond following the regulations?
Yeah, in relation to those that are already governed by EU regulations, it might be helpful to take a look at the EU regulations, and if it's the easier way for the company because they're familiar with the EU regulation and they're not so familiar with the international law that's being enshrined in the EU regulation, going to the EU regulation might be the easier way. In relation to some of these EU regulations, I think that was in relation to the Minamata Convention, and the EU regulation goes beyond the international convention because the procedure of including more substances into the lists, all these conventions work with these lists, is a little bit faster than in relation to the international convention. So, but I don't know of a case where the EU regulation, where the international convention goes further than the EU regulation, but that's a gap we would need to analyze. And then, I mean, it depends, when the companies are all in the EU and the EU regulations apply to them and you take an extra step to make sure that actually happens, okay, fine. But if it's a company outside of the EU, it might not be very helpful to approach them saying like, Article so-and-so of the EU regulation says isn't that, because that's not law that applies to them. It might not be familiar with them, and it might be the better common denominator to just discuss the international law. Yeah.
Great, thanks. Maybe, Micha, one last question to you, and then we go to Bruno and Valeska and Lotte and come back to you if we have more time. And I think one question is in the chat that is not only applicable to today's topic, but we have discussed that in various of the sessions. What does where appropriate in the context of mitigation targets mean? Are intensity targets allowed?
That's such a good question. I actually don't know. And this is actually a point that I've discussed with my colleague who's an expert on environmental due diligence. And we've also discussed this in different stakeholder groups with ministries. And this is something we need to wait and see to get more clarity on this, whether this is the appropriateness criteria, for example, from the CSDDD. But it's really difficult to specifically say when are these scope 1, 2, 3 emissions appropriate to implement here.
Thanks. Now I saw that Bruno, you have already answered also a lot of questions on the BP in the chat and in writing. However, I would still also like you to maybe answer some of them again live. I think one of the very basic questions was, will amfori BP therefore be a useful tool to fulfill all the requirements of the CSDDD in terms of risk analysis? Maybe that's something you would like to elaborate on a bit again.
Yes. So like I said in the presentation, we're not a reporting tool or a legal compliance tool. We have done mapping exercise and benchmarking regulation to our tools to identify gaps, and we do try to fill in these gaps, whether it is by improving our tools or adding new questions. For example, we recently added new questions on biogenic emissions because it was one of the requirements on ESRS, or maybe looking for partners that we can work with in order to provide our members some information in our system coming from partners. But our systems, and I think anyone out there, are not fit for reporting 100% on DDD or any of these packages because they're very complex, and they also have to do with a lot of internal information from companies. And many of the standards like ours and systems like ours, we don't ask certain confidential information from the companies. They receive information from factories, and then there's certain purchase data and things and so on that they keep confidential outside of the platform for integrity reasons. And we cannot therefore calculate certain things that they have to report on as well. So I don't think there's a tool out there that covers everything specifically to report to DDD. We don't, but we do provide certain data that members need to do, and members need to use. And a very important thing is that we focus a lot on risk. So many companies that don't know where to start, because many don't know where to start and they're a bit overwhelmed, they can use our platform to focus first on the first step, which is identifying your materiality, doing your materiality assessment, identifying where there are the highest risks are, and start working there, because that's the first step really to everything. Start somewhere, right? So that's part of the support that we provide. So not 100%, but we do provide some support and guidance. And we also have an amazing advocacy team that supports our members in understanding where they stand and what they are supposed to.
Thank you. And maybe one further question on in the direction of audit fatigue. You also answered that, but maybe you can also tell us again, you know, how the audits are visible to other members and how you reduce audit fatigue.
This is super important because there are tons of standards out there, right? We're there. HIG, which was mentioned here, is out there. People doing EcoVadis and then many other specific ones for specific sectors, right? And factories are fatigued, and it costs a lot of money as well. And also member companies, because they have to be requesting risk assessments and audits and so on. So a core part of our system is that it's collaborative in the sense that supply chains are mapped. So let's say I'm a factory in China that is producing, I don't know, it's dyeing, textile dyeing, for example, and cutting or just dyeing, whatever. And they supply to 20 members of amfori or 100 members that are in a free platform. If one member requests a risk assessment or an audit for this site, the results will be visible for anyone linked. They will not know which other members they're linked to, but they will be able to see the results. Therefore, if I'm a member and I go and I join BPI, I could find that, I don't know, 20% of the sites in my supply chain already have risk assessments that are valid or audits. And then I can focus either on someone else, or I can start focusing on some of the areas, or I can request a specific audit on one performance area that was not covered that is material to me. So this collaboration reduces fatigue for everyone, reduces costs, reduces time, and it helps companies to focus where they need to focus and complement their supply chain analysis.
Thank you. Now, Valeska, turning to you. There was one question on one of the projects, the supplier decarbonization project, and the companies that participate. Maybe you can also share again your insights on who those companies are, and especially when it comes to their size.
Yeah, there are different sizes participating. I mean, I can name them as well. It's like we have Adler, Deltex, Yaco, Kick, Lidl, Taco, and Weibo and Soxware participating, and some more. Not all have to start. The majority does not have to start to report on their scope 3 emissions, but the idea is really to learn on what data do you have to get to start having a good basis for reporting. So all of them are interested in already starting with this data collection on scope 3 emissions. I hope this helps a little bit regarding the question.
Thanks. And I think if anyone needs more information on the project, also feel free to just reach out to Valeska again. Then we're coming back to Micha. There are still a lot of questions, and the first one is on how does the provision on climate change specifically differ from the obligations for other environmental impacts in the annex?
Yeah, I think I didn't explain this so well in a confusing way during my presentation. Basically, the CSDDD has a list of human rights and environmental protected positions, and companies will have to do due diligence in relation to just these positions. And among them is not climate change, but other protected legal positions. And doing due diligence then means they have to do a strategy and implementation risk analysis measures, communicating, and so on. And the plan on climate change is different because it's not a protected legal position. So this due diligence system doesn't apply to the climate change. The climate change is like a separate climate change plan. It's a separate obligation to just do a plan in relation to climate change. And the authority also only enforces the adoption of the plan. So this is how it's a little bit separate and different.
Thanks. The next question is quite long and maybe a bit complex, and goes also into the direction of moral obligations. I'll just read it out for everyone. In the definition of environmental risk as a risk of a violation, where violation is the actual violation of an environmental obligation, is the obligation only referring to the requirements of the convention in question? Can this be also extrapolated to moral and regulatory obligations? I'll just shorten it a bit and leave it like that, but
yeah, I'm not sure how to answer this one. So generally, I mean, looking at regulations or general compliance with laws is definitely a country-specific risk factor that's important to take into consideration when doing the risk analysis to identify potential and actual adverse impacts. But generally speaking, the obligations and prohibitions from the conventions that are relevant in relation to environmental due diligence are just those that are listed in part 2 of the annex to the CSDDD. So the CSDDD takes recourse to very specific prohibitions and obligations and not others. It's important to note, though, that even though maybe some other behavior is environmentally problematic, or maybe there's some other rule from one of these conventions violated that's not taken recourse to by the CSDDD, this might constitute this human rights and environmental position of doing an emission that has a human rights impact.
And then we move to I think we have time for a couple, maybe like 2 more questions. I skipped the next one because it relates again to downstream value chain. I think you've explained that already, but then we have one that reads, is the environmental risk definition based on impacts of the company's activities on the environment, so outward looking, or based on the effects of potential risks on the company itself, inward looking, or both? How to align the risk definition with the definition in CSRD based on double materiality, where risks and opportunities means potential effects inwards and impacts that are related to outwards?
Yeah, really good question. So while CSRD looks at impacts, risks, and opportunities, so impacts being potential and actual impacts, so risks and violations, risk and opportunities being the financial materiality, not the impact materiality, the CSDDD doesn't look at all at financial materiality. In the context of the risk analysis, there's only the perspective, what impacts do companies create on humans and the environment. But obviously the CSRD in the ESRS 1 clarifies that the starting point of the materiality assessment is always the impact. So companies should always start with potential and actual impacts on human rights and the environment. And these might also constitute risks, because when companies create negative impacts on human rights and the environment, they put themselves at risks because they have to prevent and remediate, correct? There's liability issues, reputation risks, and so on.
Thanks. Maybe one more on more of a clarification question. To what extent does CSDDD take into account national law?
I think it does only in relation to very specific human rights impacts, but you can't pin me down on this one. I think it does only in relation to, but this is at least the case with the German Supply Chain Act, only in relation to the occupational safety standards. But generally speaking, in relation to these environmental positions we took a look at, the CSDDD does not take recourse to national law, and with some violations, says like as it is defined by national law, as it is defined in Article so and so of a convention, but this is generally independent. National law might play a role in the context as a country-specific risk factor when you're looking at, okay, how likely is it in this country context that there's a problem? I'm looking at the law, I'm looking, is it well enforced? But this is just an indicator.
Thanks. And maybe one that I'm not sure whether anyone has an answer, but are there any estimates about the number of companies indirectly affected by CSDDD along the value chain, a multiplier to estimate the general impact of the policy? I don't know, Micha, have you heard of any estimations, or maybe Valentina?
I haven't, but yeah, there's not only the EU companies. The EU companies estimates is 4,500, but the non-EU companies will be a lot more. I believe not a lot more than 4,500 non-EU, but the EU non-EU companies will make this number a lot bigger, I believe. But I don't know of any estimates.
Thanks. I'm afraid, Valentina, you said you read something about 80 million. Well, so quite a large number. I will see, and I'm sure that at some point we have maybe more concrete estimations. I'm afraid we're at the end of today's session. I would like to thank all of you for participating. I for sure learned a lot again, and I think also the questions, or to me at least, the questions showed that, or again emphasized also this great interlinkage between human rights and those environmental topics, because I feel like it's, you know, questions that we have seen in previous sessions as well. And I see the uncertainty that has been in the room, but I also hope that we could make things more clear, and you could also learn from amfori and the partnership, you know, some practical approaches in dealing with environmental due diligence obligations. Thanks a lot. Thanks for amfori again, also for organizing, and Micha, for your great insights. And we will for sure continue this webinar series and keep you updated about any further sessions that come up in the fall. Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Goodbye. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.